May 1945. Nazi Germany has surrendered, and the Allied forces are standing in the rubble of a devastated Europe. Even as the victory bells rang, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill ordered his top commanders to draft a highly classified war plan. It was called Operation Unthinkable, a preemptive, surprise attack against Soviet forces stationed in Germany. The operation called for 47 American and British divisions to drive straight into the center of the Soviet lines, right through the shattered city of Dresden. This diagram illustrates the military assessment delivered to Churchill. It compares the 80 Allied infantry divisions available for the attack against the 228 Soviet divisions entrenched in the region. The math yielded an insurmountable 2.5 to 1 disadvantage. The British Chiefs of Staff looked at these numbers and concluded the plan was militarily unfeasible. They recognized a state of strategic insolvency. This is the condition where a nation's desired political objectives vastly exceed its actual material and military capacity. Churchill wanted to secure Poland and check Soviet expansion, but the logistical reality dictated the outcome. The plan was scrapped because moral imperatives cannot overcome impossible math. Today, the United States faces a threat landscape that is vastly more distributed than a single front line in Europe. Every year, the Council on Foreign Relations publishes the Preventive Priority Survey. The survey asks foreign policy experts to assess specific contingencies that pose the highest risk to U.S. national interests over the next 12 months. The 2026 survey identifies several Tier 1 risks, events with high likelihood and high impact. These include an escalation of the war in Europe, a severe cross-strait crisis over Taiwan, and renewed fighting in the Middle East. Autocratic nations are increasingly acting in concert to exploit these flashpoints. This cooperation is designed to stretch American military attention and resources across multiple distant theaters simultaneously. Attempting to cover every node of this matrix using strategies developed during the unipolar moment of the 1990s guarantees structural failure across all fronts. Grand strategy relies entirely on the economic wealth and fiscal agility of the state. The United States currently holds a national debt of $36 trillion. This balance sheet is a direct threat to national security. This chart shows federal spending projections. Look at the steep upward curve of the net interest line, climbing past $870 billion in 2024. Overlaying the defense budget, the reality is stark. Servicing debt interest now eclipses the entire military budget. Because so much capital is tied up in servicing existing obligations, the U.S. government will have severely restricted access to private sector capital for military spending.
The U.S. government is forced to fund its past borrowing rather than its future defense. It lacks the financial bandwidth required to universally counter the threats identified in the 2026 matrix. Even if infinite capital were available, it must be converted into physical assets to evaluate current industrial capacity. We can measure naval power, which remains the primary method for global power projection. The U.S. Navy's fleet size remains static. Meanwhile, China's People's Liberation Army Navy has rapidly expanded, fielding modern combatants like the Type 052D destroyer. This bar chart visualizes the underlying industrial mismatch. In 2023, Chinese shipyards launched 719 large commercial and naval vessels.
American shipyards produced exactly 9. Defense analysts estimate China's overall shipbuilding capacity is 200 times greater than that of the United States. This production deficit is compounded by geography. The massive Chinese fleet operates almost exclusively in the Pacific Ocean, while the smaller American fleet is dispersed across the globe. Production shortfalls extend to precision munitions. War games modeling a Taiwan Strait conflict indicate the U.S. would deplete critical stockpiles in less than 1 week. The United States currently lacks the physical industrial base required to sustain a prolonged, high-intensity conflict against a peer competitor, capable of mass-producing its forces. A force planning construct serves as the bureaucratic framework used to size the military and justify resource allocation to Congress. Following Operation Desert Storm, General Colin Powell designed a construct requiring the military to be capable of winning 2 major regional conflicts simultaneously. Planners must balance force capacity, current troops and legacy platforms, against force capability, representing investments in next-generation technology.
Demanding a two-war capacity on a fixed budget consumes modernization capital, forcing the military to buy legacy hardware instead of funding advanced research. This severe imbalance creates a hollow force. It looks formidable on a spreadsheet because troop counts are high, but it lacks the modern equipment, munition stockpiles, and technical readiness needed to survive. Clinging to the two-war myth actively increases national vulnerability. It forces the military to field an undercapitalized force against technologically advancing adversaries. Defense strategist Frank Hoffman has proposed a shift to mission-based planning. This methodology abandons simultaneous theater war requirements in favor of strictly ranked strategic priorities. This diagram outlines the proposed hierarchy. The absolute first priority, the foundation, is defending the homeland. Cyber groups like China's Volt Typhoon have already penetrated U.S. critical infrastructure to disrupt power grids. Resting directly on top is the second priority, deterring aggression in the Indo-Pacific. Securing domestic infrastructure and mathematically checking Chinese military expansion will consume the vast majority of solvent defense resources. There is almost zero margin for error. Fully funding those top two priorities requires the arithmetic of triage. Policymakers must accept severe risk and scale back historical commitments in other areas. The third priority is strategic deterrence. Maintaining this requires an evaluation of the legacy nuclear triad, the combination of bombers, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and submarines. The trillion-dollar modernization of all three legs may need to be scaled back to remain solvent. In the European theater, the U.S. must transition away from providing large, expensive, conventional ground forces. Instead, the focus must shift to providing NATO with specialized enablers that allies cannot easily replicate, such as space, cyber, and intelligence assets. Withdrawing these legacy commitments consolidates resources around high-priority objectives to prevent absolute strategic failure. Just as British planners in 1945 respected the math and chose not to execute an impossible war, modern U.S. leadership must embrace ruthless prioritization. A military sized to do everything is equipped to win nothing.